Hello, welcome, and thank you all for joining in today. I'm Jennifer Keller, the Programming and Events Coordinator at the Westport Library. In honor of last month's anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote in America, tonight we'll learn about the leaders of the next fight, the Equal Rights Movement. Before I introduce our speaker, please note that you can ask her a question through the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of your screen. We will try to get to them after her presentation. You can also purchase a copy of Julie's book to be picked up at the Westport Library when you're contacted. And that's also at a link through the link at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Julie Suk, the author of We the Women, the Unstoppable Mothers of the Equal Rights Movement. She's a frequent commentator in the media on legal issues affecting women, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CBS News. She's a professor of sociology, political science, and liberal studies at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Julie has also taught law school at Cardozo Law School, Harvard, Columbia, University of Chicago, and UCLA. And this fall, she's a visiting professor at Yale Law School right up the road. Julie, we're so glad that you could find time to discuss this important movement with us today. And now I just give you the screen and you can tell us all about the women we should be so thankful for.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. It's great to be here with you at the Westport Public Library. And I've never heard that before. I give you the screen, but I'm happy to have it. And I'm here to talk with you about my new book, We the Women, the Unstoppable Mothers of the Equal Rights Amendment. And I want to point out that this week, we are going to see Constitution Day on September 17th, this coming Thursday. Constitution Day, September 17th, 1787 was the day on which the U.S. Constitution was adopted. It was signed by 39 men, known as the Founding Fathers of the United States. Some of the most famous Founding Fathers, like George Washington and James Madison, were actually slave owners. And the Constitution that they signed on that day, which got ratified and went into effect in 1789, began with the words, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." It's a famous preamble. We teach our children to recite these words and to respect the laws made under this Constitution and to revere the Founding Fathers who created American democracy. But the Constitution that the Founding Fathers wrote and adopted was not perfect. And indeed, the preamble acknowledged that by discussing the need to form a more perfect union. It was not perfect. It was far from perfect. And it included many provisions, for example, that protected slavery. And even though the preamble actually said, "We the people," the Constitution did not say or do anything to ensure that all people who were expected to live under the Constitution and laws made under the Constitution had the blessings of liberty, freedom, or rights. African Americans remained enslaved in many parts of the United States, and the laws of almost all the states actually denied women basic rights and freedoms, including the right to vote and the right to own property. And very recently, last month, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the constitutional amendment, the 19th Amendment, that reversed the history of discriminating against women with regard to the right to vote. My book, We the Women, tells another story about our Constitution, the story of forgotten founding mothers, the women who persisted across generations to enshrine their equal status as full persons and citizens in our nation's fundamental law. The Constitution, which, despite its flaws, has been an inspiration for generations of children and the citizens they become. the lawyers and the lawmakers that try to bring the Constitution's ideals to life, and to free people all around the world. In telling the story of women's long battle for the Equal Rights Amendment, I hope that this book will expand the boundaries of what we imagine possible, not only for women, but for all aspects of our political life that need improvement. And today in 2020, there are so many. By thinking about what's possible under our Constitution and expanding that, I hope that we can perfect the future of our Constitution and our life together as Americans. So I'm going to focus on the themes of my book. It really goes through what the ERA is, the Equal Rights Amendment, who made the ERA, and that's the most important focus, the founding mothers who actually fought for at least 100 years to get a new constitutional amendment that was about women's equality. How the ERA would actually work for women, especially working mothers, who have so often been left out of public policies that are even about women's equality. And finally, why it matters now in 2020 at this very moment in our nation's history. So I'm going to begin by explaining what the Equal Rights Amendment actually is. And I think some of us are familiar with the ERA largely because there was a television show on Hulu FX called Mrs. America that featured a historical moment in the 1970s when the ERA was actually stopped by Phyllis Schlafly, played by Cate Blanchett. And so many of us might believe that the ERA is actually this thing, this retro thing in the past that was stopped and is no longer relevant. But in fact, after the ERA was stopped, there have been movements to revive the ERA since 2017, with ratification being completed just earlier this year. And before I get into that, though, I want to explain what the ERA actually says. That it's a constitutional amendment which would actually enshrine the principle that women and men have equal rights in the document that we hold up as our fundamental law. So the text of the ERA just says that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's the primary and substantive guarantee that's in that amendment. And then other portions of the amendment, there's a section 2 that gives Congress the power to actually enforce the Equal Rights Amendment. And then another provision that says that the amendment goes into effect 2 years after it's ratified. And most constitutions around the world actually have an Equal Rights Amendment, a provision like this. They don't have the exact same words, but almost every constitution in the world says that men and women shall have equal rights, or that nobody shall be subject to discrimination because of that person's sex. That most constitutions explicitly refer to women or explicitly say that denial of rights based on sex is a constitutional violation. But the US Constitution actually doesn't. It's important to note that it's the kind of thing, a guarantee of equal rights between women and men, that's so common throughout constitutions that not having one makes us a little bit of an outlier. And we might even ask, what would it be like to have the only constitution in the world, for example, that didn't guarantee free speech or other things that we hold dear? And it's an important question now to ask why we don't have an Equal Rights Amendment, and more importantly, what women have been doing for the past many decades, almost 100 years, to get this provision added to our Constitution. And given that women have been trying to get this provision added to our Constitution for this long, it's important for us to explore why it actually did not succeed. Why did it fail for so long? And what's happening now in 2020 to try to finish these efforts to bring the US Constitution into the 21st century. So I want to go back actually to the moment when women got the constitutional right to vote in 1920, since we are celebrating the centennial of that achievement today. So when women got the right to vote, and the 19th Amendment simply says that the rights of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. Now that provision, when the suffragists finally won it, they had actually been struggling for that amendment since the middle of the 19th century. And they finally succeeded after over 70 years. That was in 1920. And many suffragists believed, though, that they wanted more than the right to vote. In fact, the reason they wanted the right to vote was so that they could use the vote to change other laws that kept women down. So the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced in order to guarantee equality in all realms of life, not just voting. Now, we have to understand that when the ERA was actually introduced, the laws of many states denied women equal rights, denied women rights as a general matter. So made it so that married women could not own property rights or vote. Married women didn't even have the right to refuse to have sex with their husbands, which led them to be constantly bearing children and obligated to raise children without any kind of economic independence from men or from their husbands. And this problem, which the ERA was supposed to solve in 1923 when it was introduced on the heels of the suffrage amendment, was actually a problem that was discussed long before women even got the vote. It's in 1848 and possibly sooner, certainly sooner, that women were drawing attention to their lack of property rights and also their lack of voting rights. But 1848 is an important moment because when a women's rights convention gathered at Seneca Falls, they produced a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, in which they drew attention to this very problem. They echoed what our founding fathers actually said in the Declaration of Independence. They said that if people were going to be subject to laws, they needed to be represented. And the Declaration of Sentiments drew attention to the importance of voting because it drew attention to all the ways in which there was tyranny of men over women, because men had rights to property. Men could control, even if a woman worked outside the home, men could control women's earnings, and the law permitted that. So these were all the problems that the ERA was introduced to get rid of in 1923. And some famous suffragists, including Alice Paul, and lesser-known suffragists like Crystal Eastman, worked on the Equal Rights Amendment to try to get rid of all of those discriminations against women. But one of the difficulties in the 1920s was that not all the women's groups who supported suffrage supported the Equal Rights Amendment, because they were living during a time when the Supreme Court, all men, of course, at that moment, was actually very hostile to rights in general, and specifically the rights of working people. And so they were using many constitutional provisions that existed, including the 14th Amendment, to strike down protections for workers. And a lot of the women who had lobbied for suffrage were afraid that an Equal Rights Amendment might be distorted by a conservative judiciary to get rid of protections for women working in industry. And it was only when the women who were supporting working women and working mothers, it was only when they began to see, after the New Deal, that such laws might actually be helped or preserved by an Equal Rights Amendment, that the tide began to turn in the 1940s, where more women started to support the Equal Rights Amendment. And very importantly, women of color, led by African-American suffragist Mary Church Terrell and the National Association of Colored Women, began to support the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1940s. But it's really important to note that the main reason that even the suffragists in the 1920s supported the ERA, and you see this through line throughout the 1940s, was that they were primarily concerned with women's subordination within the family. That is, women, because they were mothers, were excluded from rights and were expected only to stay within the domestic and family sphere and exercise no rights that would enable them to be economically independent outside the family and independent of their husbands. So that was really an important part of the project, both in the 1920s. And then finally, in the 1940s, there was a lot of attention drawn to the fact that, especially because of World War II, women were, whether by choice or necessity, more and more becoming breadwinners outside the home. And so the fact that they did not have equal access to jobs and equal access to educational opportunities became more of an issue to which advocates of the Equal Rights Amendment drew a lot of attention throughout the 1940s. And so there's increasing support, but you don't really see the ERA getting any traction really in Congress until the 1950s. And even then, it was only the Senate that passed it by the requisite majority. Now, one thing that I think we often study our Constitution's provisions on rights, like the right to free speech or the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment. But we often, when we teach the Constitution to our children or even study it in law school, we pay actually very little attention to the Constitution's rule for amendment. Article 5 of the US Constitution sets up the game. And Article 5 of the US Constitution actually requires Congress to adopt an amendment to the US Constitution by 2/3 majority in both houses. And only then does it go to the states for ratification. Once it goes to the states for ratification, you need 38 states, because the Constitution says you need 3/4 vote you need 3/4 of all the states to ratify a constitutional amendment. And so initially in the 1950s, only the Senate voted to pass the ERA, but the House didn't follow. And the reason the House didn't follow was that there was actually a man in the House Judiciary Committee that kept it bottled up in committee and didn't even give it a floor debate within the House. And this went on for decades. So by the time there's any real traction in Congress for the ERA, it's in 1970 because Congresswoman Martha Griffiths from Michigan uses a discharge petition, which is actually a very rarely used maneuver, but it was the only way to get the House to actually debate the Equal Rights Amendment. And so she uses the discharge petition, requiring her to get the signature of half of the House just to get that amendment debated on the floor. And this actually points to something that's actually really difficult. And it's difficult today because women only constitute 23.7% of Congress. And in fact, when the ERA first made it out of Congress and got sent to the states for ratification, women constituted 2% of Congress. And if you think about what it has taken to amend the Constitution under Article 5, Article 5 requires tremendous supermajorities, both in Congress and a large supermajority of state legislatures to change the Constitution formally. And the 19th Amendment took a really long time, largely because, well, how do you get the vote without the vote? Women did not have the vote. They were not represented. And when they were not represented, they had to convince men who held power. They had to convince them from the outside, not holding any power. They had to convince those who had power to give up some of the perks of having the vote all to themselves. So that was the 19th Amendment. And with the Equal Rights Amendment, of course, women had the vote. But very interestingly, even since the 1970s, women make up such a small proportion of Congress that even today in 2020, women don't even have enough power in Congress to block a constitutional amendment. Because remember, you need 2/3 of Congress. You would need 1/3 of Congress to block a constitutional amendment, let alone to pass a constitutional amendment. And that also explains why the ERA has taken so long. What happened, though, is that once the ERA got onto the floor of the House, an overwhelming majority of men in the House were persuaded. And so they adopted the ERA by over 90% of the vote in 1970. But then it stalled in the Senate. And even though there was overwhelming support in the Senate, it stalled because a couple of powerful opponents insisted that they could possibly improve the ERA by making a few tweaks, including a 7-year deadline on ratification. And so the ERA actually died in the early 1970s in the Senate because a few powerful men stopped it there. And one of the holdups was they insisted on a 7-year deadline. And then elections were here, and there was no time for the House and the Senate to really reconcile their two competing versions of the ERA. So it dies. And then when it finally comes back in 1971, Martha Griffiths, the chief sponsor of the ERA in the House, insisted, or not insisted, she agreed to having a 7-year deadline on the ERA at that point because she needed to quiet some of the vocal critics, even though they were very much in the minority at the time. And that's how we get a 7-year deadline on ERA ratification. And it's a deadline that ends up haunting and ultimately stopping the ERA for a whole generation. Because what happens is that even though now, of course, in 1971 and 72, the ERA is actually adopted by Congress and sent to the states for ratification, a lot of the states ratified it really quickly. By the time you got to the end of 1973, just a little over a year, most of the states in the United States actually ratified the ERA. We had 30 states by then. By 1977, there were 35 states, but that's 3 states short of being ratified fully to be added to the Constitution. And this is the time when Phyllis Schlafly's Stop ERA movement began to stoke a lot of fear about what the ERA would actually do. And here, this is what's really important. When the ERA was actually successful in Congress in the 1970s, many of the discriminations under the law that women were concerned about in the 1920s were actually repealed, even by the early 1970s. By the early 1970s, married women could own property. Women obviously had been voting for 50 years by then. But the reason they really wanted the ERA then was that there were still some discriminations that had not been repealed. Some states actually exempted women from jury service, which is not to say they were excluded, but they exempted women so that it made it so that women were given certain so-called privileges. Women didn't have to serve on a jury. Women didn't have to be drafted into the military. But what that meant was that women generally didn't serve on juries and generally didn't serve in powerful positions and generally had second-class status. And the Supreme Court, by that moment, did not interpret the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution, the 14th Amendment, to prohibit sex discrimination as a matter of law. And so a lot of the women who proposed the ERA wanted a constitutional amendment that would get rid of anything in the law that perpetuated women's second-class status. But one of the mistakes that was made in the 1970s, the misinformation and the fear, stemmed from the belief that the ERA would actually get rid of every possible sex distinction that the law or public policy can make. And that was not actually what the proponents wanted. It was not actually what was being proposed. What the proponents wanted was an amendment that would get rid of practices and policies and laws that actually perpetuated women's second-class status. But many of the opponents claimed that the ERA would lead to women being disadvantaged more because it would get rid of protections that women needed. That fear, I think, stalled the ERA, but very importantly, and one part of the story that I try to tell that I think has not been so much part of the public understanding of the ERA is that the reason the campaign of confusion and fear was so successful is that we existed in a political structure that made it difficult to have a really clear and fair debate about the ERA in the state legislatures, in much the same way that there were a few key powerful opponents in Congress that kept the ERA bottled up in committee, therefore not debated, throughout the 1950s and 1960s. A similar dynamic existed in many state legislatures, including in Virginia, for example. So as the ratification clock, the 7-year deadline, was ticking in Virginia, there are a few powerful men who were opposed to it in the House of Delegates, and they prevented the ERA from getting a fair debate or even a fair vote on the floor of the Virginia legislature for many years as the clock was ticking and the deadline was coming. And so the deadline worked with these dynamics to really stop the ERA. And under those conditions, creating fear and confusion is actually very effective if there isn't actually going to be a deliberative democratic debate about something so important as a constitutional amendment proposal. And so a very important part of the story as this happens is that in Congress in 1978, a lot of the women led by Congresswoman Liz Holtzman was the congresswoman who actually unseated Emanuel Seller, the guy who had been keeping the ERA bottled up in committee for decades. Liz Holtzman unseated him in 1972, and she became a leader in the fight in Congress to extend the ERA deadline. And they extended it in 1978 by only 3 years. But the 3 additional states did not come in with their ratifications during that time. And in 1982, since the new deadline lapsed, many people believed that the ERA was expired, and they forgot about it for quite a while. But in 2017, Nevada ratified the ERA. In 2018, Illinois ratified the ERA. And in 2020, Virginia ratified the ERA. So that adds up to 38 states. And after the 38 states ratified the ERA, the House, led by many women, record numbers of women in the House, and women of color in the House, like Pramila Jayapal, led the fight to extend the deadline, and not only extend the deadline, just to remove it altogether. So in Congress, the House actually voted this year in 2020 to recognize the ERA as a valid part of the US Constitution whenever it's ratified by 3/4 of the states. And 3/4 of the states have actually ratified it as of January of this year. And the story of ratification is an important one for thinking about women as constitution makers, because in Nevada, the fight was led by Senator Pat Spearman in the Nevada State Senate. Pat Spearman is a veteran. She served in the military for several decades. As a member of the LGBT community, she actually fought Don't Ask, Don't Tell while she was in the military. And then as a state legislator, in addition to championing the ERA, she has championed all kinds of legislation to promote the rights of working women, legislative initiatives on equal pay, legislative initiatives on pregnant worker fairness so that women who are pregnant can get accommodations in the workplace so that they don't get fired for being pregnant. These are all things that she has worked on, and it's part of a vision of the ERA that was around since the 70s and has been given new life and new meaning today, where the legislators who believed in it did not believe that the ERA was just going to be handed over to a bunch of Supreme Court justices or conservative judges to interpret it however they liked. A lot of the women who championed the ERA in the 70s and who are championing the ERA in the state legislatures now believe that the ERA is important because it will generate new legislative and policy proposals to make equality real for women on the ground. And this is really important because I think one of the misconceptions that's out there about the ERA is that once we get it, it'll be like a magic bullet that gets rid of all the things we don't like about women's role in American society, like unequal pay and misogyny and toxic masculinity and sexual harassment. That's something that is largely driving the movement. But what's really important is that the ERA is like a lot of other constitutional provisions. If you think about what's in the Constitution, one might say that the Constitution, the US Constitution at least, is a bit of an underachiever. That is, we have rights provisions, including even the First Amendment. The First Amendment we think of as being a free speech amendment, but all it actually says technically is that Congress can't make any laws abridging the freedom of speech. And the ERA, all it says really is that the equality of rights under the law shall not be abridged or denied by the United States or the states, the government. So it doesn't necessarily act like a bullet to get rid of all the forms of sex discrimination that exist or gender inequality that exist in American society. But what the ERA does is that it gives political legitimacy that's a long time in the making to lawmakers and lawyers and policymakers who will write specific laws to make equality real for women. Those laws include things like Pregnant Worker Fairness Acts. In Nevada, they also passed legislation protecting victims of domestic violence from being adversely treated in the workplace. And you see that same dynamic when Illinois ratified the ERA in 2018. The movement to ratify the ERA in Illinois, this is Phyllis Schlafly's home state, was largely catalyzed by a reaction to the concerns that spawned the Me Too movement. In Illinois, there was increased attention to sexual harassment in the Illinois legislature itself and to cultures of toxic masculinity in the Illinois legislature and in Illinois politics. And those dynamics led women to form a task force on sexual harassment and gender violence. It led women to form a caucus in the legislature to focus on women's policy issues. And one of the first things they rallied around was ratification of the ERA. But the idea is that the ERA becomes kind of like this force field, this organizer of a wide range of legislative initiatives, both at the state level and at the federal level, to make equality real for women. And then in Virginia, what I love about the Virginia story is that the women of color who led the effort in the Virginia legislature were of all generations. So you had a baby boomer, Mamie Locke. You had Gen X, Jennifer McClellan in the Senate, and then a millennial, Jennifer Carroll Foy, in the Virginia House of Delegates, leading the effort. And in Virginia, the story was so much about being on the right side of history. Virginia is the birthplace of some of our most famous founding fathers who held slaves. Virginia is a place that has struggled with its Confederate past and Confederate monuments. But in recent years, Virginia is a place where women have been winning elections and holding more seats in the Virginia legislature, including immigrant women, a transgender woman, Danica Rome, women of a variety of religious faiths, including the first Muslim American woman delegate seated this year. And so the idea behind ratifying the ERA was not just about technically what it would do as law, but about finishing a project to bring the state to the right side of history. And I want to leave you then with the reason why I think completing the ERA is so important. There are a lot of technical legal issues, legal questions we could ask about what the ERA would actually do. And even though we don't have an ERA in the US Constitution, a lot of the problems that the proponents of the ERA in the 1920s and in the 1970s wanted to solve have actually been solved by other constitutional tools, including the Equal Protection Clause. So we don't need the ERA to solve specific legal problems because women lawyers, feminists have been extremely resourceful in using portions of the Constitution that were not intended to help women to help women. So we don't need the ERA solely for that purpose, although I will say that some of the Supreme Court's jurisprudence around sex discrimination has fallen short on precisely the issues that many ERA proponents have cared about, specifically the inequalities that women face because they are mothers, specifically pregnancy discrimination, and lack of pregnancy accommodation, specifically the persistence of sexual violence and public policy responses to sexual violence. The Supreme Court's jurisprudence has fallen short when they've tried to deal with these issues using the Equal Protection Clause. But that's not the only or even most important reason why the ERA matters today. I would say that the most important reason is the who question, we the women. Women have been fighting for equal rights for 100 years. And even though they've been successful to some degree, that success hasn't even been recognized by adding their amendment to the US Constitution. And the lack of recognition and the undercompensation of women is precisely the problem to which the struggle for equal rights is a solution. So if we do add an equal rights amendment to the US Constitution, it'll make all these heroic women into founding mothers of the Constitution. If the amendment is not officially added to the Constitution, these women are not founding mothers. They're women who have been trying to remake the Constitution. And I think it's so important in 2020 that we have an inclusive and representative democracy and a Constitution that reflects that inclusion. And if we can't get an ERA added to the Constitution, this is a provision that most constitutions have that are a normal part of constitutions in the modern world, constitutions made in the 20th and 21st century. If the United States can't get such a provision added to the Constitution, maybe there is something wrong with the Constitution, that we have a process that makes it so hard to change the Constitution, that we have a process that makes it so hard for those who were excluded at the beginning to be fully included today. And I'm hopeful that if we can actually get the deadline removed and add the ERA to the Constitution, it'll open up a new conversation about other things that are obsolete and need fixing in the US Constitution. There's been a lot of attention to the fact that the US Constitution doesn't actually have an affirmative guarantee of the right to vote during a time when many people are worried about whether everybody who is entitled to vote will in fact be able to exercise their right to vote in November. And there are other things in the Constitution, including the Electoral College, for instance, that people have been criticizing for at least 20 years, if not longer. But we've given up as a nation on the constitutional amendment process, largely because we know that efforts to use the amendment process to do things that seem very morally unassailable, like a guarantee of equal rights for women, that process has led to failure. So I hope that women can lead the way in rethinking what it means to have a constitution that is adaptable to the 21st century and that includes everyone. And I'd love to take questions from the audience now.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Julie. That certainly gave us a lot to think about. So we have a few questions that I will just read them out to you.
Great.
I'm trying to figure out which order to put them into, but I think I'm going to go with this one first. So after all this time of working to get the ERA ratified, now that we have the requisite number of states behind it, just quietly become an amendment now, or do we still need to do more? And is there still like another 2 years of fighting to do.
Mhm.
You know, that part is sort of unclear.
Great. Well, there's actually a real controversy and a lot of disagreement amongst lawyers and even amongst proponents of the ERA about that question, because the 7-year deadline is actually a little bit mysterious. It is a normal part of constitutional amendments in the 20th century. So since the Prohibition Amendment, which was ratified in 1919, Congress has been kind of routinely putting 7-year deadlines on the ratification of constitutional amendments, although none of the amendments that were made before the Prohibition Amendment, so the first 17 amendments, had these deadlines, right?
Mhm.
Now, Article 5 of the Constitution doesn't mention deadlines. So one way of interpreting Article 5 is, since it doesn't mention deadlines, deadlines are not allowed. So even if we've been using the deadlines for the last 100 years, they were actually legally null and void. So some people believe that. And so if you believe that, then you believe that because we have 38 ratifications as of January 27th, 2020, when Virginia ratified the amendment, by that theory, the ERA is already part of the Constitution. Now, the ERA also says it doesn't go into effect for 2 years. So it's part of the Constitution, but we can't start enforcing it until 2 years from January 27th. Okay, so that's one theory. Another theory, though, is that Congress has the power. Since Congress has the power to propose amendments under Article 5 of the Constitution, that proposal power includes just basic procedural housekeeping tasks around proposing an amendment, and putting a time limit on it is just a regular housekeeping part of what it means to propose an amendment. And so if you believe that, then the deadline is valid. And so some folks are saying, and the Trump administration believes, that because the deadline was valid, it lapsed in 1979, and so it's over. The only way you could get the ERA now is to reintroduce it in Congress and pick up 38 ratifications all over again, right? But I'm a proponent of the middle ground position. So I think that Congress probably does have the power to impose deadlines, but the historical experience shows that Congress also has the power to change the deadline. And they did that once already with the ERA in 1978. And I think that's what the House tried to do this year by voting to just remove the deadline altogether. And if the Senate follows, the Senate has not followed. There are 48 sponsors, so just a few votes short of extending or removing the deadline in the Senate. If the Senate also removes the deadline, I think at that point, we do have an amendment, which again would take 2 years to go into effect. One of the issues, though, that has come up is that in the 1970s, some of the states that actually ratified the amendment also voted to rescind the ERA. So they said yes, and then they changed their mind. And this also poses a really interesting problem, because some people say that since they changed their mind, the count now, it should not be 38, it should be 33. And the reason that's also a pretty controversial position to suggest that rescissions are okay legally is that in our constitutional history, if it were true that rescissions are valid, then we might not even have the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed formerly enslaved African Americans equal protection of the laws. Arguably, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment is the thing that most Americans think of as the value they hold most dear, the idea that all persons are equal before the law and that it's written into our Constitution. But guess what? There were states that had slavery and did not want the 14th Amendment. And so they were kind of forced to ratify it as a condition of being admitted back into the Union after the Civil War. And some of those states rescinded their ratifications of the 14th Amendment. And in that situation, Congress said, we're not going to let you rescind. A ratification is a ratification, and the Constitution only talks about ratifications. So Congress decided, and I think that's the key point. Congress is in the driver's seat. And I think similarly, it's up to Congress now to decide whether or not to recognize the rescissions. But I think that the ERA is similar to the 14th Amendment in terms of the proposition it entails of equality of rights. And so I think there's a very strong moral argument that the decision maker, i.e. Congress, should not recognize the rescissions of the ERA. And so if Congress acts to both remove the deadline and to reject the rescissions, I think that's what will make the ERA perfectly legitimate as a part of the Constitution.
Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't realize that there were some states that had rescinded. So that leads actually perfectly into the second question that we have, which is, why is it so easy for the states to not debate constitutional amendments at this point? Like, how is it that the states can just decide, I'll just wait until next year to talk about this? You know, like, how is that built into the Constitution, I guess?
So it's built into the Constitution by the structure of our government, which is federalism. So we have a federal government, but it's made up of states. And there are some provisions of the Constitution, including the 10th Amendment, that affirm the sovereignty of the states. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know how far that takes us. The fact on the ground is that every state legislature makes its own rules. And so every state legislature, so let's take a look at a state like Illinois. So another thing that you don't learn from watching Mrs. America, because Illinois is Phyllis Schlafly's state, where they defeat the ERA many times. The Illinois legislature actually voted by a majority to ratify the ERA several times in the 1970s. And if it were any state other than Illinois, those votes would have counted as a valid ratification of the ERA. However, in Illinois has its own internal rule within its legislature that says, if Congress ever sends us a federal constitutional amendment, we must ratify it by 60% of the vote, not just a bare majority. And so even though the ERA got bare majority several times of both houses of the Illinois legislature, it was not validly ratified in Illinois until they got up to the 60% threshold, which happened in 2018. And even then, it just, it almost missed it. It was a very close vote in Illinois. And so the point is that state legislatures make their own rules. So if they decide that even though 2/3 of both houses of Congress decided it was time to amend the Constitution, a state legislature could say, not interested. We're not going to debate that. We're not going to vote on that. And it's not even the state legislature. There might be, and Virginia is another great example. In Virginia, there were more than half of the Virginia legislature was interested in voting yes on ERA ratification. The Virginia House of Delegates, they had the votes to do it in 2019, last year. But there was a small committee that controls whether or not any resolution gets debated on the floor or voted on the floor. It's the Privileges and Elections Committee. And they decided they weren't sending it to the floor. So it was really 4 opponents who were able to stop it from even being debated and voted upon, even though it was well known that there were 51 people in the House of Delegates who would have voted yes, and possibly more if you'd actually had a debate about it, on the theory that people who debate about things learn more and do the right thing. But it is true that generally state legislatures are sovereign and have a lot of autonomy, and we have not written anything into into the U.S. Constitution that says anything like, if Congress proposes an amendment, the states must at least debate it or vote on it. Nothing that says that. So they have quite a degree of freedom.
Wow. Okay, so in the very beginning of your talk, you said that other countries have their ERA already put into their constitutions.
Yes.
Was that something that happened a long time ago or relatively recently, just to sort of give an idea of, what else is going on in the world?
It is a 20th century development. So in Germany, the Weimar Constitution in 1919 has a provision that says men and women shall have equal rights. The Weimar Constitution, of course, has other provisions that enabled Hitler to rise to power. So the Weimar Constitution there were many aspects of the Weimar Constitution that were scrapped after World War II. But interestingly, many of the rights provisions were considered an important and innovative development in modern constitutionalism. And so the West German Constitution, known as the Basic Law, adopted after World War II, preserved that provision that said men and women shall have equal rights, and added another provision that said there would be no discrimination on the basis of sex, as well as other protected characteristics. So it's not just Germany, but then you get the UN Charter after World War II. And so the UN Charter also proclaims the principle of equal rights between women and men, and many constitutions that are written after World War II, and even some that are written around World War I, contain a provision that specifically refers to equal rights between women and men, or the need for the law to stop discriminating on the basis of sex. So it's really at that moment, because of the rise of international human rights in reaction to World War II, and the spread of constitutionalism. So countries are actually learning from each other after World War II. And that actually makes its way into legislative hearings about the Equal Rights Amendment as well. Mary Church Terrell, the African-American suffragist testifying on behalf of the National Association of Colored Women, she talks a lot about working women and their need for equality. She also talks about the Japanese Constitution and how the Japanese Constitution has an ERA and therefore is guaranteeing rights that women in America do not yet enjoy. And I think that it's a powerful statement, and she's not the only one. There's references starting from the 40s all the way up through the 70s, and through ratification debates that are happening in states like Virginia just in the last year. The fact that it's such a staple, an equal rights amendment is such a staple of modern constitutionalism, is a very powerful argument that has been made for generations.
So when you were researching for this book, did you find anything in the papers or any of the history that you went through that you had to read over more than once and said, what is this? Or something that really surprised you while you were doing the research?
So I think what really did surprise me was the extent to which it was opposed. And it was opposed on the floor. So what is this? So Sam Ervin, who is a Democratic senator in North Carolina, and before he became one of probably the most vocal opponent in the Senate of the Equal Rights Amendment, he had also filibustered against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is the source of modern anti-discrimination law in the United States, prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race and sex and national origin in the workplace. So he had filibustered against that. He was opposed to the ERA, and he gets up and says he's speaking for the mothers of America. He says God couldn't be everywhere, so he invented mothers. And if we get an equal rights amendment, it's going to end American motherhood as we know it, right? So these are things I knew about, but I think sort of seeing them said and taken seriously. And then you see the pivot when he realizes that those arguments are not really winning. He also really focuses on procedure. Like, hey, why doesn't this thing have a 7-year deadline? Don't we need that? And of course, he ensured that the 7-year deadline would get put in, and then he used the 7-year deadline So he called up his friends in the North Carolina legislature. And there are all these tricks that you could use in the state legislature to make sure that something doesn't get a hearing. And it's a way, if you use procedure like a deadline, it's a way that someone can kind of oppose equal rights without really saying so, without taking the political heat for it. If there's actually a floor debate and you vote against it, your voters will know about it when there's another election. But if you say, there's a deadline, and we have other things to do, so it's not making it to the floor this year, maybe next year, then people don't see your true colors as a politician and as an elected representative. And I think these are the kinds of dynamics that played well in stopping the ERA in the 1970s.
Okay. All right. I'm realizing now that I'm on a screen that I should never play poker because I do not have a poker face about certain things. Thank you, Julie, so much for bringing this to Westport. This has been such an eye-opening event for us. For those of you watching at home, remember that you can borrow a copy of We the Women from the library, or you can purchase one for pickup at the link at the bottom of the page, or purchase it from any of your favorite booksellers. We don't mind. This program will be available to watch again in just a few minutes through the same link that you used today. So you can share this link with your friends and family members and get them a little bit more educated about the Equal Rights Amendment. For other videos from previous programs and information about coming events through the Westport Library, remember to visit westportlibrary.org. Thank you once again, Julie. This was a fabulous evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.